The library doors don't officially unlock until 8, but Molly has been inside since 6:15, savoring the secret life of the building before the world wakes up. This is the hidden slice of her day that nobody else sees, a pocket of absolute silence where she can breathe before the public remembers she exists. She moves through the towering mahogany stacks like she's performing a private ritual, which, in a way, she is. The scent always hits her first, a thick cocktail of aging paper and leather bindings, mixed with the faint, sweet smell of dust motes that carry the weight of 3 centuries. Her fingertips trail along the spines as she walks, and she knows many of them by touch alone, recognizing the grain of the buckram or the chill of a foil-stamped title. While the rare collections stay locked in climate-controlled glass, the main floor has its own internal temperature and a specific breathing pattern she's learned to read like a familiar face. 7 years as the head librarian has given her enough time to turn this institution into a sanctuary, and she knows every quirk of the architecture by heart. The floorboards groan in a specific sequence, like the third plank from the east window that always sighs a half second before the morning sun hits the reading tables. Near reference desk D, the wood has a soft, rhythmic squeak that sounds remarkably like a spoken question mark, and these tiny sounds have become her primary languages. The windows are massive, impractical, and completely perfect, allowing the light to pour in heavy columns that turn the floating dust into something visible and holy. The quiet at this hour isn't just an absence of noise, but a heavy presence full of potential, as if thousands of stories are holding their breath and waiting for a pair of hands to open them. Molly settles behind the massive front desk with a cup of coffee that is dark, bitter, and exactly how she likes it when there's no one around to judge. Her morning routine is a mapped-out masterpiece of efficiency, involving returns to shelve, new acquisitions to process, and archive sensors to verify. She craves this level of structure because she learned a long time ago that chaos only lives in the gaps where people stop paying attention. The clock on the wall clicks to 6:47, leaving her with exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes of beautiful, uninterrupted solitude. She is mentally cataloging the Thompson collection of 16th century maps when a sound breaks the peace, something heavy and deliberate that doesn't belong in her world. It's the unmistakable strike of boots on hardwood, far too loud and aggressive for a Tuesday morning. And the rhythm of the footsteps is entirely wrong. Up with a sudden electric jolt. Feeling. Up with a sudden electric jolt. Feeling very much like someone just flipped a high-voltage switch in a dark room. She refuses to look up immediately, because the first rule of maintaining authority is never reacting before you've had a chance to assess the threat. She finishes her handwritten note with a hand that remains perfectly steady, sets her pen down with a quiet click, and finally raises her eyes toward the main entrance. A man stands silhouetted against the glass doors, the blinding morning light behind him making it impossible to see his features, though the shape of him tells her everything she needs to know. He isn't a patron looking for a cozy chair, but rather a man carrying a kind of physical weight that has absolutely nothing to do with the books on the shelves. Kicks in, telling her he isn't here to cause physical harm. Yet the desperation rolling off him is so thick she can almost taste it on her tongue. Desperate people are the most unpredictable element in any environment, and in her experience, they are the ones most likely to break the things they touch. She stands up slowly, tugging her cardigan straight to reclaim her professional armor, and meets his gaze across the vast, silent distance of the lobby. This is her territory, her kingdom of paper and ink, and every line of her posture tells him that he is the outsider here. He begins to walk toward the desk with a predator's gait. Molly wonders, just for a heartbeat, if the sanctuary she spent years building has a breaking point that she hasn't discovered yet. She wonders if this man's need is larger than the rules she uses to keep the world in order, and it looks like she's about to find out the hard way. He finally reaches the edge of the desk, and Molly gets her first clear look at the man who just shattered her morning peace. He's wearing a charcoal gray coat that looks soaked through from the rain, and the fabric is expensive enough to tell her he's used to having exactly what he wants. His dark hair is plastered messy against his forehead, as if he's been running through the weather without a care for the cold. But it's his face that truly stops her heart. The lines of his jaw are sharp and clenched so tight she can see the muscle jumping, and his eyes are a shade of amber so intense they make the skin on her neck prickle. The man is tall, but it's more than height. He's built with a rugged density that suggests he takes up space without ever feeling the need to apologize for it. His hands come to rest on the polished wood of her desk, and she immediately notices his knuckles are bruised and raw, looking like he recently had a disagreement with something that didn't want to move. Then the scent hits her, a sensory collision she wasn't prepared for, featuring the smell of cold rain mixed with something deep, woody, and metallic. He smells like a mountain thunderstorm and a quiet threat, a combination that bypasses her logic and slams straight into her primitive brain. His voice is a low, subterranean rumble that vibrates through the heavy desk and settles deep in her chest before she can even process the words. I need the archives, the sealed ones. There is no greeting and certainly no please, just a blunt demand delivered with the expectation that she should already be reaching for her keys. Molly keeps her hands flat and steady on the counter, drawing on years of experience dealing with patrons who think their personal emergencies override the laws of physics. She's dealt with the arrogant ones who view librarians as minor obstacles in their path, and she knows exactly which script to use to bring them back down to earth. We aren't open for another hour, she says, keeping her voice at a low, controlled volume that forces him to lean in if he wants to hear her. The archives have very specific restricted hours, so you'll need to schedule a formal appointment and bring the right credentials before I can let you back there. He doesn't flinch or blink, but instead just stares at her as if she's speaking a dead language that has no relevance to his current reality. I don't have time for appointments. He grinds the words out like they're made of glass, and as his knuckles turn white against the desk, she realizes his control is a very thin rope fraying at the ends. Molly leans forward just an inch, a calculated move to reclaim the space he's trying to dominate with his size. Then you have a significant problem, because those are the rules we live by here, and I don't make exceptions for anyone, regardless of how urgent they think they are. A flicker of something dark and recognition-filled passes across his face for a split second, telling her that her words actually landed somewhere beneath his armor. He leans in closer, the motion so slow and deliberate that she can track every heartbeat of the shift, until his massive frame is casting a long shadow over her workspace. The light from the high windows makes his eyes look like glowing embers, and the weight of his stare becomes a physical pressure she can feel against her skin. The air between them turns electric and heavy, mimicking that suffocating pause right before a massive thunderstorm breaks, when the entire world seems to be holding its breath. His voice drops even lower, losing the volume but gaining a dangerous edge that makes a shout seem like a friendly greeting by comparison. I can tell you're frustrated, Molly says, using the calm, de-escalating tone she perfected for high-stakes situations where one wrong word could cause a scene. But you need to understand that raising your voice in my library isn't going to get you through that door any faster. The silence stretches out between them until she can hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the mechanical hum of the building's ventilation. Her own heart is drumming against her ribs, and she focuses every ounce of her will on making sure he can't see the pulse jumping in her throat. Then his lips pull back into a smile that has nothing to do with warmth or kindness. "Make me," he whispers. In that moment, Molly realizes she's just passed a test she didn't even know she was taking, and the rules of her sanctuary have officially been rewritten. She doesn't flinch. That's the first move, and honestly, sometimes that's the entire game. Just refusing to break when someone expects you to shatter. Her heart is hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she can feel pulsing in her throat and down in her wrists. But her face remains a perfect, stony mask. This is the core of de-escalation training. The art of keeping your expression professional and controlled while your internal systems are screaming in a language your face refuses to speak. The thoughts racing through her mind tell a much more chaotic story, as she realizes he's testing her, and she's just managed to pass the first round by holding her ground. Underneath that small victory, there's a deeper, more primal recognition she isn't ready to name. Something that sparked the moment he leaned in and let his voice drop into that dangerous, velvet whisper. She stands up slowly, making sure the movement isn't a reaction to his command, but a deliberate choice to reclaim her own physical space. With calculated intention, she pushes her chair back and rises to her full height, which doesn't even come close to his massive frame. Yet it feels like a definitive line drawn in the sand. The air between them has become thick and suffocating, vibrating with the kind of electric tension that precedes a lightning strike, when the atmospheric pressure drops and everything feels unstable. She is suddenly hyper-aware of the smallest details, from the cadence of her own breathing to the scent of rain and cedarwood clinging to him, all while his heavy stare pins her in place. Molly feels her internal monologue start to spiral as she wonders why his proximity feels like a physical force, a magnetic pull that defies every protocol and professional boundary she's ever spent years building. She forces those feelings down into a locked compartment, deciding to process the fact that her body is reacting to him like a predator later, when she's safely alone and far away from his heat. She meets his eyes with a directness that refuses to waver, offering no submission and no hint that she's willing to drop her gaze just to make him feel more powerful. "The archives close at 5, she says, her voice coming out steady and calm despite the fundamental shift she feels happening in the way her nerves are registering his presence. "If you want access, you come back during business hours with the proper credentials and follow the established process, because my rules are not up for negotiation." His expression remains unreadable, but the tension in his jaw uncoils just a fraction as his shoulders shift, almost like he's resetting his internal calibration to account for her resistance. "And if I don't?" His voice is still a low rumble that vibrates in the small space between them, but the edge of the threat has softened into a genuine question. Molly leans forward, just an inch, not as a retreat or a sign of surrender, but as a sharp challenge that closes the gap between their chests. "Then you're trespassing in a private institution after hours, which means I call security and the police, and whatever you're hunting for becomes 100 times harder to find." She lets the silence hang there for a beat so he can see she isn't bluffing, making sure he understands that she holds a specific kind of authority he can't just muscle past. It's the power of the gatekeeper, the person who knows the labyrinth of the system better than anyone else, and she watches him realize that her cooperation is his only real path forward. "I don't think that's what you want, because you're looking for something specific, and you know I can find it faster than anyone else in this building," she says, glancing at the clock. "So you're going to come back in 53 minutes when we officially open, tell me exactly what you need, and then we'll see if the library can help you." Her heart is still performing a frantic solo against her sternum, but her hands stay perfectly still where they're resting on the cool surface of the desk. He stares at her as if she's just flipped the board on a game he thought he'd already won, his predatory energy transforming from outward aggression into a dark, focused intrigue. He takes a deliberate step back, a measured retreat that feels like a conscious choice to play by her rules for the first time since he walked through the door. 53 minutes, he repeats, as if he's testing the weight of the words in his mouth. 53 minutes, Molly confirms, her voice final. He turns and heads for the exit with a heavy, rhythmic stride. And it's only when the door clicks shut that she realizes she's been holding her breath the entire time. He returns at exactly 9 o'clock, not a second early or a second late, moving with a precision that suggests he's been watching the clock with the same intensity she has. The library is fully awake now, with morning light streaming through the high windows in thick columns of dust-moted gold, while a few early patrons drift quietly through the towering stacks of books. When he steps through the entrance, the atmospheric pressure in the room seems to drop, causing a woman in the fiction section to look up with a confused, wary expression before she shies back into her novel. Molly watches him approach from her post at the desk, having spent every one of those 53 minutes trying not to think about his bruised knuckles or the desperate hunger in his eyes. She keeps coming back to the way he said, "Make me," a phrase that sounded less like a taunt and more like a plea for someone to finally set a boundary he couldn't break. He stops at the desk, and while the danger is still radiating off him in waves, it's been pulled tight and tucked away under a layer of rigid, forced composure. "You're back," Molly says, an obvious observation that serves as a quiet acknowledgement that he chose to respect her timeline and return on her terms. "I'm back," he says, his voice sounding rough and unused, like the words are being dragged over gravel after a long period of silence. "I need information on a family from 30 years ago, specifically any records or legal documents connected to the name Thorne." Molly feels her professional instincts sharpen instantly, because the name isn't just a data point, it's a weight he's carrying, evident in the way his hands flatten against the wood of the desk. She sees the flicker of vulnerability cross his face before he can mask it. A brief crack in the armor that tells her this search is deeply, painfully personal for him. "What kind of records are we talking about?" she asks, knowing that the right question is often the only way to unlock the truth hidden behind a patron's defensive walls. "Anything you have, from family trees to property deeds, because I'm looking for a specific woman who—" He cuts himself off, his jaw working as he struggles to find the right word. "Someone I need to find." The raw desperation in his tone tells her everything she needs to know about the years he's likely spent searching for answers that have remained just out of his reach. Molly nods, and the dynamic between them shifts completely as she stops defending her territory and steps into her role as the one person who can actually navigate the chaos for him. "Come with me," she says, stepping out from the safety of the desk and signaling for him to follow her into the heart of the collection. He trails behind her like a gathering storm, his presence a physical weight that makes the air feel charged and heavy as they move toward the climate-controlled wing of the building. They pass into the quiet of the archives, where the scent of old leather and the hushed, expectant silence of 1,000 unread pages create a world that feels disconnected from the city outside. The aisles are narrow and cramped, forcing them into a proximity that makes her skin hum, the scent of cedarwood and rain from his coat filling the small gaps between the shelves. It isn't a hostile feeling anymore, but it is constant, a tangible, vibrating reminder that he is right there, watching her every move with an intensity that makes her pulse quicken. "The sealed family records are kept in this section," Molly explains, her voice dropping to a low murmur as she reaches for a specific shelf she knows by touch alone. "We house everything from genealogical charts to old legal filings that go back nearly a century for the founding families of this area." She slides a heavy, leather-bound volume from its place and hands it over, her fingers brushing against his in a brief contact that sends a sharp, electric jolt up her arm. She doesn't pull away, and neither does he, the moment stretching out until the weight of the book finally anchors them back to the task at hand. His eyes race across the ink-stained pages, and she watches the muscles in his face tighten as he finds the entry he's been hunting for through God knows how many dead ends. A soft, broken whisper escapes him as he stares at the name, and when he looks up at her, the predatory mask is gone, replaced by something so raw it's almost hard to look at. "That's her," he breathes, his gaze searching hers with a mix of shock and dawning realization. "How did you know?" Molly steps into his space, the distance between them vanishing until she can feel the heat radiating off his chest, and she keeps her voice just as low as his. "Because it's my job to see what people are actually starving for, even when they're too afraid to ask for it out loud." He doesn't move, just stands there staring at her like she's the answer to a question he didn't even know he was asking. The archive feels like it's shrinking around them, the narrow aisles and heavy stacks of leather-bound books closing in until there's no room left for distance or defense. Lucas turns his massive frame fully toward her, effectively swallowing up the small pocket of space that was supposed to be hers. Back here, the lights are softer and warmer, catching the sharp edge of his jaw and the ridge of his cheekbone, while he grips that record like it's the only thing keeping him grounded. "That's her," he says, his voice dropping into a low, rougher register. "I've been looking for 3 years, wading through dead ends and closed doors, and people who suddenly forgot how to speak the moment I mentioned her name." Molly takes a step closer, and she's acutely aware that this is a deliberate choice to narrow the gap. She could have stayed back or reclaimed that professional wall that usually sits between a librarian and a patron, but instead, she lets the boundary blur. "What happened to her?" Molly asks. "Tell me a thing, and I need to understand tell me a thing. And I need to understand why she just vanished into thin air." The way he says need makes it clear this isn't just a casual curiosity or a hobby. This is a hunger, something deep and primal that's been chewing on him for years. He reaches up to the shelf right beside her head, moving with a slow, heavy deliberation that gives her plenty of time to realize exactly what he's doing. His arm extends, effectively trapping her in the small gap between his chest and the bookcase, and suddenly she's pressed against the cool leather of centuries-old books while he radiates heat and cedarwood. There's a sharp, metallic scent clinging to his skin, something like rain-soaked pavement and a quiet anger at the world. "My library," she says quietly. And that, my library, she says quietly. And that means my rules still apply. He lowers his arm by inches until his hand rests on the shelf right next to her shoulder. He isn't touching her yet, but he's close enough that the warmth coming off his body feels like a physical weight against her skin. What if I don't want to follow your rules anymore? His voice is a low, dangerous rumble that vibrates in her chest long before her ears can even process the threat. The air between them is thick enough to choke on, saturated with that primal, undeniable energy that her body recognizes as a predator before her mind can catch up. His breathing is jagged and uneven, like he's fighting himself for every lungful of air, and his knuckles are turning white where they grip the wood of the shelf. Molly doesn't step back, because sometimes the entire conversation is just about holding your ground and refusing to flinch. She looks him right in the eye, and what she finds there isn't the dominance she expected to see. Underneath the mask of control, there is a desperate, crushing loneliness. The look of a man who has been carrying a mountain on his back for so long, he's forgotten how to stand up straight. Then you leave the library, she says, her voice as steady and calm as if they were discussing late fees instead of standing in a dark aisle surrounded by 1,000 dead secrets. And you don't come back, because this, she tilts her head just enough to gesture at the space between them, doesn't get to exist in a place built on rules and order. His hand flexes against the shelf, and she watches the exact moment he realizes she isn't playing a game or testing him, stretches out, heavy with the weight of the choice he has to make, while his presence continues to radiate that dangerous magnetic heat. "What if I want to follow your rules?" he asks, and the shift in his tone is so subtle it's almost a ghost of a sound. "What if that's exactly what I'm looking for?" Molly realizes right then that this isn't a simple power struggle between two people trying to win. This is about two souls who have built their walls so high and so thick that they've completely forgotten how to let the light in. They are both so used to wearing armor that the idea of being seen without it is more terrifying than any threat. She turns to face him fully, a slow and intentional movement that brings them chest to chest in the cramped aisle of the archive. His arm finally drops from the shelf because there's nowhere else for it to go except against his side or around her waist. Her internal monologue is screaming that this is dangerous, but it's drowned out by the realization that this is the most alive she's felt in a decade. Molly doesn't ask for space, and she doesn't look away. She just holds his gaze with a clarity that cuts right through the tension. "You can want whatever you want," she says softly, "but you are going to respect this building, and you are going to respect me, or you can walk out that door right now." It isn't a threat or a challenge, just a boundary stated with the kind of quiet authority that only comes when you know exactly who you are. Real power isn't about forcing someone to bow down. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than total respect. His expression shifts, the predatory edge softening into something much more raw and complicated, like a structural flaw just appeared in his foundation. "I respect you," he says, his voice sounding like tires on gravel. "I've respected you from the second you told me to lower my voice and treated me like a human being." Molly's breath hitches because there's a massive vulnerability hiding under those words, an admission she wasn't prepared to hear. He reaches out with agonizing slowness, his hand moving toward her face before stopping just an inch short of her skin. His palm hovers there, letting her feel the heat of him without forcing the contact, and he waits for her to bridge the final gap. He's giving her the choice, putting the power back in her hands and waiting for her signal. Molly leans into the heat, not quite closing the distance, but making her intentions absolute. She is choosing to stay, choosing to see where this goes, and choosing him. When his hand finally makes contact, his thumb brushes her cheekbone with a gentleness that feels completely at odds with his size. It shouldn't be possible for someone with hands that look like they could crush stone to touch her like she's made of glass and gold. She reaches up and lets her fingers find the damp, heavy fabric of his coat, feeling the cold rainwater on her wrist while his body heat pulses underneath the layers. He's a sensory collision of ice and fire, a vibration that she can feel deep in her bones. "What's your name?" she asks, realizing she's been calling him Lucas in her head without ever actually hearing him say it. "Lucas," he answers, his thumb never stopping that slow, rhythmic motion against her skin. "My name is Lucas." "Lucas," she repeats, testing the weight of the name and the reality of the situation. She's standing in a climate-controlled room full of dead people's secrets, trapped by a man who smells like a storm, and she's never felt more awake. The relief of surrender isn't about losing herself or giving up her power to someone else. It's that singular moment when two people finally stop performing and drop the masks of competence and professional distance. It's about just existing in the quiet space between who they are and who they pretend to be for the rest of the world. His other hand comes up to cup her face, and suddenly she's surrounded by him. The scent of rain, the cedar wood, and the heavy magnetic pull of his presence. "I'm sorry," he whispers, his breath warm against her forehead. "I'm sorry for how I broke into your world and for not respecting your sanctuary." Molly's hands tighten on his coat, anchoring herself to him. "You're respecting it now," she says, "and that's the only thing that matters to me." The archive falls silent around them, thousands of stories and secrets tucked away on shelves, while they start to write one of their own. In this tiny gap between the stacks, the past and the present don't matter as much as the connection sparking between them. The moment stretches out, long and heavy, and neither of them moves to break the spell. He pulls back just enough to catch her gaze, and the change in his voice is startling. That dangerous edge is still there. It's woven too tightly into his DNA to ever truly vanish. But the sharpness begins to bleed out of it. It's as if he's unbuckling a heavy suit of armor, piece by piece, right there in the middle of the stacks. "I came back because my mother disappeared 32 years ago, when I was just a kid," he says, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "She just left, without a single word or a note. And while my father claimed she couldn't handle the family business, I never believed a word of it. I've spent my entire life haunted by the hole she left behind." Molly watches him with the kind of intense focus she's developed over 7 years of reading the subtext in people's lives. She isn't just processing the facts of his story. She's feeling the jagged grief and the decades of abandonment vibrating underneath his words. The questions he's carrying have clearly been rotting away at him since he was a boy. "The records in that book contain her maiden name and a note about a sealed legal proceeding my father never mentioned," he continues, his jaw tightening under her palms. "I had to know what she was running from, or, more importantly, who she was trying to reach before she vanished." She can feel the tension humming through his skin as he fights to keep his composure through sheer, stubborn will. Her hand slides from his face down to his chest, where his heart is hammering against the damp fabric of his coat. It's a fast, erratic rhythm, like a drum that's lost its beat, while his body struggles against an emotion his mind is trying to crush. "What are you so afraid of?" she asks, and the question isn't meant to be a comfort. It's a surgical strike, designed to cut through the dominance and the performance he puts on for the world. It's the only question that actually matters in this suffocating silence. He doesn't offer a verbal answer, choosing instead to close the remaining inch of distance until his forehead rests against hers. They are suspended in that electric, agonizing space between a kiss and a simple embrace, caught between what they crave and what they're terrified to do. The atmosphere in the narrow aisle is heavy enough to drown in, yet she finds herself wishing he wouldn't move an inch. His breath is ragged against her skin, and she can feel his entire frame trembling from the massive effort of holding himself back. Every muscle in his body seems locked in a civil war between his primal desperation and the respect he's forcing himself to show her. He's honoring the library, her rules, and every boundary she spent the morning drawing in the sand. Molly's thoughts finally stop racing and settle into a cold, clear realization that surrender isn't about weakness or giving up. It's about the relief of finally letting go. She slides her hand up to his neck, her fingers spreading across the warm skin where his pulse is currently sprinting. Her other hand bunches into the fabric of his coat, anchoring him to the floor so he doesn't drift away. "You can let go," she whispers against the sensitive skin where his jaw meets his neck. "You don't have to do it here in my library, but you can let go with me." The vulnerability of that moment feels devastating for both of them. He's standing in the private archives of a woman he met only hours ago, confessing secrets he's likely never whispered to another living soul. Beneath the layers of alpha dominance and projected danger, there's just a boy who's been waiting 3 decades for the truth. He's a man who has no idea how to ask for help without making it sound like a declaration of war. She stands there, pressed against his heat in the climate-controlled silence, holding a man she's supposed to treat with professional detachment. He's the same person who stormed into her sanctuary making demands, yet he's made her feel a visceral connection she thought was a myth. His arms eventually find their way around her, moving with a slow, cautious grace, as if he's learning how to hold something fragile without crushing it. He rests his chin on top of her head, and she feels the exact moment he finally exhales a breath he's been holding for half his life. "I don't know how to do this," he admits into her hair, his voice muffled and raw. "I don't know how to be anything other than the man who broke into your world this morning." "Then we figure it out together," Molly says, her voice steady enough for both of them. They stay locked in that embrace for what feels like an eternity, though the clock on the wall probably only ticked forward a few minutes. Time loses its linear shape when you're suspended in a moment of pure recognition, especially when the armor you've worn for years is finally starting to crack. Molly keeps her hand flat against his chest to keep him grounded, and she tracks the gradual shift as his breathing finally levels out. The frantic pounding of his heart begins to slow, and the iron-hard tension in his shoulders eases just a fraction with every breath he takes. It's a slow process, like watching a mountain settle after a landslide. He doesn't pull away, and she doesn't give him a reason to. When Lucas finally moves, he only goes far enough to look her in the eye, and she watches the final walls crumble in real time. The amber in his gaze fades into something much softer and completely unguarded, which is both terrifying and beautiful to witness. He's still a dangerous man, and he likely always will be, because tenderness doesn't just erase a lifetime of survival instincts. He's still carrying the weight of the search and the abandonment that's been carved into his very bones since childhood. But there is a visible crack in his exterior now, and she realizes she's the only person he's ever allowed to see what's inside. Molly is the one to break the silence, her voice soft but carrying a weight of absolute certainty. "You can come back tomorrow during our normal business hours," she tells him quietly. "We can sit down and go through the rest of these archives together." She's careful not to frame it as a romantic gesture, because she's offering him something that might actually be more valuable than a date. It's an invitation to be seen and known without the mask, a chance to stop carrying his history as a solitary burden. She's telling him that he doesn't have to explain why the weight is so heavy anymore. He offers a slight nod that is so subtle it's almost imperceptible. As his hand drops away from her face, his fingers linger for a second against her wrist in a touch that feels like both a question and a final answer. It's a silent promise to return and a commitment to keep showing up, even if it means letting her see him without his dominance as a shield. They walk back toward the main library at a slow pace, leaving the cramped intimacy of the archives for the wide-open spaces of the reading room. The energy between them has transformed into something that can actually survive in the daylight, rather than just in the shadows of the stacks. Morning light pours through the tall windows and splashes across the polished wood floors. A few regular patrons look up as they walk by, and Molly can tell they notice the shift in her posture and the way she carries herself. There's nothing about their behavior that violates any library policy, but the very architecture of the room feels like it's been rearranged. She leads him all the way to the heavy front doors, where he stops and lingers at the threshold. He rests one hand on the frame and looks back at her, seemingly trying to memorize the sight of her standing in her own sanctuary. She looks like she belongs there, framed by columns of light and rows of ancient knowledge. His final words are a low whisper, meant only for her ears. "Thank you for not being afraid of me," he says. Molly takes one small step closer, not to close the gap, but to show him she's making a conscious choice to stand her ground. "I am afraid," she admits simply. "I'm just not afraid of you." He nods once, looking like that single sentence was the only thing he needed to hear to get him through the night. Then he turns and walks through the glass doors, disappearing back into the morning rain and whatever burdens he still carries. Molly stays there at the threshold, watching him fade into the gray weather, knowing with total certainty that he'll be back. He'll follow her rules because something has shifted in both of them that can never be put back the way it was. The door clicks shut. The library returns to its usual silence. But for Molly, the quiet feels completely different now. Once Lucas disappears, Molly just stands there, in the gap between the library and the world outside, watching the heavy rain swallow him whole. Her hands are shaking. It's not a subtle tremor. They're actually shaking as her body finally catches up to the adrenaline crash. She pulls the door shut with a slow, deliberate click and leans her weight against the cool glass. Morning light still pours through those tall windows, looking holy and untouched. But the sanctuary itself has shifted into something unrecognizable. The air feels thick and charged, as if he left a physical weight behind when he walked out the door. It's like his presence embedded itself into the old floorboards and the climate-controlled archives, refusing to evaporate. Molly finds herself walking back toward the stacks without making a conscious choice to move, her feet simply taking over the navigation. She passes the front desk and the early patrons who are just now settling in with their coffee, moving deep into the narrow aisles where the leather-bound secrets live. The spot where they stood together still feels warm, as if the building's ventilation system hasn't figured out how to regulate the temperature back to normal yet. The air carries a ghost of cedarwood and rain that vibrates in her chest, making her feel the phantom weight of him still pressed against her. She reaches out to touch the exact shelf where his hand rested, finding the leather binding cold and indifferent beneath her fingertips. On the surface, everything is back to the way it was when she walked in at 6:15 this morning. Yet she knows her internal compass is spinning wildly. Her mind is a tangled mess of questions, wondering what just happened and what she's supposed to do with the memory of his touch. She tries to force herself back into a professional rhythm by sitting at her desk and opening the acquisition log, but the words just blur into meaningless shapes. The letters scatter across the screen because her brain is busy replaying his whisper and the way her body responded before her logic could intervene. She leaned into him like he was a destination she'd been searching for without even realizing she was lost. For 7 years, she's been building this fortress, controlling every single variable and keeping a perfect, sterile distance between herself and the public. She spent those years perfecting a life made of rules and structure where competence was her only real relationship. Then Lucas showed up, and in 20 minutes, he dismantled every single brick of that foundation. But here's the thing that keeps her heart racing and her skin humming. It didn't feel like a loss or a defeat. It felt like the most intense relief of surrender she's ever known. She realizes now that she's been lonely in a way she couldn't acknowledge until someone finally looked past the librarian persona and the authority. He didn't see the carefully constructed version of Molly that belongs to this institution. He saw her, the actual woman, and he didn't look away. The wall clock ticks over to 10:47, leaving 7 hours and 13 minutes until she can finally lock up and go home. She finds herself checking the time every few minutes, wondering if he meant what he said about coming back tomorrow. She tells herself there's no reason to doubt him, but the silence of the library feels heavier with every passing hour. What if that connection only made sense in the shadows of the archive, in that strange space between the past and the present? It's terrifying to think it might all fall apart under the harsh light of a normal day, where he has to make a real choice to show up. She tries to lie to herself, whispering that she was just being kind to a man in the middle of a crisis. She tries to frame it as professional de-escalation or simple compassion, but her racing pulse tells a much more honest story. The library doesn't feel like a fortress anymore, and it's lost its status as a refuge from the messy world outside. Now, it's a space where something unpredictable is waiting to happen, and the most frightening part is that she isn't sure she wants her invulnerability back. As the end of the day approaches, she moves through her evening checklist with a slow, agonizing deliberation. She checks the window locks twice and organizes the book returns with unnecessary precision, just to buy herself a few more minutes in the building. When she finally turns the key at 5 o'clock, the world outside is still gray and soaked, looking completely uninviting. She drives home in a total daze, hearing the way he said her name and feeling the archive hold them, like it was protecting something precious. She doesn't know how to categorize these feelings yet, but she knows she's finally stopped being numb. Molly pulls into the library parking lot at 5:47 the next morning, which is over an hour earlier than her usual arrival time. She tries to tell herself she's just sticking to a routine, but it's a total lie because she's never felt this much urgency to get to work. She isn't just opening the building. She's preparing the stage for a sensory collision she can already feel coming. The storm has finally moved on, leaving the morning gray and perfectly still, in that heavy way the world gets before it fully wakes up. She moves through the empty aisles with a sharp sense of purpose that has nothing to do with shelving books or filing paperwork. She's making room for him, ensuring the sanctuary is ready for his arrival, whether he actually shows up or not. She carefully arranges the archive materials on a central reading table, laying out the records with his mother's name and the old legal documents. It's a silent invitation, a way of saying she saved these pieces of his history just for him. The morning light hits the tall windows with a new clarity, making everything in the room look sharper and cleaner than it did yesterday. It feels as though the rain washed away a layer of dust she hadn't noticed, revealing the true colors of the wood and stone. She catches her reflection in a glass partition and notices the dark blue sweater she chose instead of her usual neutral gray. Her hands made that choice while her mind was still foggy with sleep, her body acting on a primal instinct she hasn't quite admitted to herself yet. She won't say it out loud, but her heart is already pounding against her ribs in anticipation of the door opening. The way she moved through her apartment this morning had a frantic energy that had nothing to do with her professional responsibilities. At 8:15, the front door finally creaks open, but it's just Mr. Chen arriving for his usual morning newspaper routine. She gives him a polite nod, watching him settle into his corner while she goes back to staring at the clock. 8:47 passes, then 9:03, then 9:22. And with every minute, the fear of him not showing up starts to outweigh the fear of him actually being there. Then, at 9:47, he finally walks through the entrance. He looks different in the full light of day, more human and less like a predator, which somehow makes him feel even more dangerous to her composure. He's traded the soaked coat for a dark gray sweater, and his hair is still damp from a recent shower. The bruise on his knuckles has already started to fade into a dull memory. Or perhaps she just imagined it was worse than it actually was. He's holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He holds one out toward her with a silent question in his eyes, and Molly reaches for it, like it's both a peace offering and a binding contract. Their fingers brush during the handoff, and this time, the contact is deliberate and lingering. "Dark, black, no sugar," he says in a low voice that vibrates in her chest. "I remembered how you liked it." Molly takes a sip, and the fact that it's exactly right feels more significant than a simple cup of coffee should ever feel. It means he was paying attention to the small details, and it means he was thinking about her long before he stepped back into this building. "Thank you," she replies. And they both know the words are carrying the weight of everything that happened in the dark yesterday. They walk toward the archives together, but the forced proximity doesn't feel like a high-stakes standoff anymore. It feels like a rhythm they're starting to build, a natural synchronization of their movements. She leads him to the table she prepared, and when he sees the organized documents, his expression softens into something vulnerable. The hours start to disappear as they work through the records together, page by page and memory by memory. He tells her his story in small, jagged pieces, and she listens with a level of focus she's never given to another human being. She's not just interested in the drama of his life, she's genuinely interested in the man sitting across from her. Time seems to lose its meaning in the quiet of the stacks. At one point, Lucas reaches across the table and takes her hand in a way that feels honest and grounded. "Of this," he admits quietly, his gaze locked onto hers. "I definitely wasn't expecting you." Molly squeezes his hand, feeling the heat of his skin against hers. "Neither was I, Lucas, but here we are." A patron eventually calls out for help, forcing Molly to break the moment and step away to do her job. But when she looks back over her shoulder, he's still there, choosing to stay in her space. He's still here, and for the first time in 7 years, Molly doesn't want to be anywhere else. The day drifts toward closing time, and Molly feels the atmosphere shift in a way that's hard to pin down. It isn't the sharp, dangerous tension from yesterday, but something more uncertain, like they're both balancing on a high ledge without knowing how to step forward. Long columns of afternoon light stretch across the floorboards as the last few patrons begin to drift toward the exit. The library is settling into that heavy evening rhythm where the world starts to shut down and the books seem to go back to sleep. Lucas starts helping her close up without a single word being exchanged between them. He just moves, returning the research materials they pulled and double-checking the locks on the archive cabinets with a strange, sudden familiarity. It's as if he spent the last few hours learning the heartbeat of this building. Or maybe he's just been learning her. They work in a silence that actually feels comfortable, establishing a wordless rhythm through tiny shared gestures. He already knows which heavy volumes belong in the reference wing, and she's realized he gravitates toward the east windows when he's deep in thought. Without ever sitting down to discuss it, they are building something real between the stacks. By the time the heavy front door clicks behind the final visitor, the clock on the wall reads exactly 4:53. They have 7 minutes left. Molly moves through the grand reading room and cuts the lights one by one, leaving the tall windows as her only source of vision. The library transforms in the dark, turning into something softer and far more intimate, almost as if the building is finally exhaling after holding its breath all day. Lucas is standing over by the fiction section, his massive frame a dark silhouette as he watches her finish her rounds. When the final overhead light clicks off, the air between them becomes thick and almost unbearable to breathe. The room is all sharp angles and deep shadows now, stripped of the clinical clarity of daytime. She walks toward him with slow, deliberate steps, and her voice is barely a whisper when she finally breaks the silence. What happens now? He doesn't give her an answer right away, instead looking at her like he's trying to burn every tiny detail into his permanent memory. He tracks the way the fading gray light catches the stray strands of her hair and the specific slope of her shoulders. His hand reaches up to her face without any of the hesitation he showed before, leaving no room for doubt or permission. He touches her skin with a gentleness that feels impossible for a man of his size and power, especially with that lethal edge that always seems to hum just beneath his surface. Now, he says, his voice a low vibration that she feels in her own chest. We figure this out, whatever this is. Molly leans her weight into his palm, feeling the relief of surrender wash over her, though it feels different than it did this morning. It's deeper and more grounded, because she isn't surrendering to his strength, but rather to the terrifying choice to be seen without her armor on. Even so, she's vibrantly aware of the power she holds in this quiet moment. She could easily pull away or set a hard boundary to protect the life she's built over the last 7 years, meaning the choice belongs entirely to her. Instead of running, she chooses him. She steps into his space, and his arm hooks around her waist to anchor her firmly against the heat of his body. His hand feels steady and warm against the small of her back, holding her like she's something precious that's actually worth the effort of being careful. The moment stretches out, hovering in the space between a conversation and a kiss. It isn't quite an embrace yet, but it feels more intimate than anything she's experienced in years. Her internal monologue finally goes quiet, leaving her at peace without any need to analyze or calculate her next move. She is just here, present and real, in the cooling air of the library. She whispers the one question she actually needs him to answer. Come back tomorrow? His response is immediate, cutting through the dark without a hint of a second thought. Every day, he promises, if you want me to. The weight of that statement hangs in the air, and while it isn't some grand, cinematic declaration of forever, it feels much better. It's a simple commitment to show up and keep choosing each other in a building that has become so much more than a sanctuary. They stand there in the silence until the darkness feels like it might swallow them whole if they stay a second longer. Lucas eventually steps back, his hand dropping from her waist, though his fingers linger against hers for one last heartbeat. He heads toward the exit, with Molly following close behind, their silhouettes reflected in the glass as they move toward a future neither of them understands. At the threshold of the building, he turns back one last time to look at her. Thank you, he says, for seeing me. Molly meets him at the boundary where the library ends and the outside world begins. Thank you, she replies simply, for letting me. He gives her a single nod, looking like he finally got the answer he was searching for, and then he disappears into the gray evening. Over the following week, Lucas weaves himself into the daily rhythm of the library until his presence feels as natural as the books. He shows up for every one of her shifts, helping with the heavy lifting or disappearing into the archives to read. The regulars start to notice the change too, seeing how Molly's entire energy shifts the moment he walks through the front door. The peace is tested one afternoon when a difficult patron starts getting aggressive over a late fee. Molly can practically see Lucas's protective instincts catch fire, his body tensing as if he's ready to end the confrontation by force. But instead of acting, he looks to her for a cue, and she gives a small shake of her head. He stands down immediately, showing a level of respect for her authority that she didn't expect from a man like him. That evening, once the building is empty and the lights are low, Molly finally asks the big question. What is this, Lucas? He pulls her into his space, his scent of rain and cedar wood surrounding her completely. It's something worth building slowly, right here in your library, where everything follows the rules. In that moment, she realizes the truth of the situation. The library hasn't changed at all, but she definitely has. Molly stands by the library window, watching Lucas arrive for his shift with a quietness that replaced his old snarl. She still thinks about that first "make me" whisper, realizing she did more than just lower his voice. She made him stop running. And while the library is still her sanctuary, it feels deeper and no longer lonely.